preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I hope that as a result of our meeting this morning, there may be some differences of opinion engendered, some controversies, perhaps even some conflicts, but at least a confrontation of thoughts and ideas, some of which may be antithetical to some of you, hopefully anyway, because that's what an exchange of ideas is all about. When Vivian and Omas Hirschbein called me and asked me if I might step in this morning, there were certain questions that they said had already been mailed out to those of you who are subscribers to the series. The first one of which, and I'm sure you're familiar with all three because they appear in this little card, which you've all seen. The first of them is, how can today's composer innovate his art and not alienate his audience? I find this a little paradoxical, given the fact that the series is titled New Ideas, because of course there is absolutely nothing new about this question, this thought. How can a composer innovate? Let me broaden it out a little bit and make it refer to all the arts. How can an artist innovate his art and yet not alienate his audience? And this has been a concern of artists down through recorded history. If we were meeting 500 years ago, we might be discussing the case of Palestrina, who was a distinguished composer of the time and who was fighting against certain edicts that the church had set down with respect to how music should be written, what should be the form, and what should be the guiding ideas behind the creation of music. Palestrina had certain individual ideas which were contrary to those precepts that the Pope had established. And it was a traumatic experience for Palestrina to create what ultimately became his Pope Marcellus Mass, because in the creation of that Mass, he ran counter to all the precepts that the church had established for the creation of music 500 years ago. If we were meeting, and let me just, before I leave Palestrina, say that the thread of the Palestrina struggle has remained a constant one in the creation of music, even to the point of earlier in this century, the Palestrina struggle having figured as the basis of an opera by a then contemporary German composer named Hans Pfitzner, Pfitzner. Pfitzner titled his opera Palestrina, and the dramatic action of the opera deals precisely with this conflict of the artist in conflict with his society. That was 500 years ago, and the thread continuing into the early years of this century. Let's move ahead a couple of centuries. Let's take it to the time of Goethe in the late 18th century. Great German poet and dramatist, excuse me, himself at odds with the forces at work in his society, creating a work titled Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, The Sorrows of the Young Werther. Now, in creating his character Werther, Goethe created an artist. Autobiographical? Yes, in large measure. An artist in conflict with mores, precepts, principles, traditions, which he had to struggle against. And ultimately, Goethe created a very simple solution for his artist. His artist committed suicide, was unable to contend successfully with the forces at work against him. And so he took one way out. He did away with himself, did away with his creative impulse. So that we really, in this new ideas concept of how can the artist, and I guess now let me zero in and go back to the wording of the folder, how can the composer, the musician, how can he innovate his art without alienating his audience, has been a question that arts and artists have faced from the beginning of time. In our own time, we find a variety of different ways of answering this question, and many different composers offering up their own answers. There are those composers who say, society be damned, custom be damned, and the audience be damned. We are writing out of the depths of our inner being. We are creating what we must create, and if we find an audience, fine. But we are absolutely unconcerned about whether or not there's an audience out there that wants to hear what we have to say. There are other artists who say, yes, we will create out of the depths of our being, but always with an eye toward communicating. Because after all, that's what music is all about. It's a means of communicating, a form of personal communication from one vibrant, dynamic, creative force to the public. I say the public rather than the mass because I mean that very specifically. The mass is something quite else. The public is something different. On the other hand, there are those artists who say, I will not be concerned with anything but that which I know will communicate. If the public wants C major scales, I will provide C major scales. If the public wants music that's induced by computers, that's the area that I will carve out for myself. Now, there's something to be said for each of these philosophies, and there is something to be said against each of them. If there's an artist who feels that there is a rather cynical approach to creativity, and that's the artist whom I would class in that last group that I described, the artist who will give the public what it wants, whether it represents anything from within him or not. If there's that kind of cynicism, it's in response to currents that are at work in society. So there is that positive reaction that one can have to an artist who does nothing but feed the public, and I don't want to use any negative terms here, that feeds the public what the public wants to be fed. If there's an artist who maintains that he will arrive at some sort of middle ground, he will be impelled by the forces within him, but always with an eye to communicating, that's a kind of a historical mainstream composer or creator who has always existed in the history of the arts internationally. If there's an artist who paints himself into a corner and says, I care not what anybody wants to hear, whether I'm creating what anybody is going to be listening to or not is no concern of mine. What I am doing is that which I feel I must. That, too, is based on extraordinary and continuous perspective through the years of history. From the time that we consider the established repertory as having come into being, and by that I mean the late 18th century and the great mainstream of romantic music during the 19th century, until the present time, there have been ferments and boiling pots in the creation of music. No sooner did Haydn and Mozart establish formal principles in the classical tradition by solidifying what it was that sonata form was all about, what it was that theme and variations were able to accomplish, what it was that rondo meant in establishing certain relationships from movement to movement. From that time, we come only a few years later to Beethoven, who systematically, slowly at first, and then very precipitously toward the end of his creative life, kicked aside the precepts of form. And we're really talking about a very brief period in history. And Beethoven, who died in 1827, set the pattern for the entire Romantic revolution of the 19th century. And revolution it was. It was a total reversal of that for which classical music had achieved its greatest stature. Classical music had a certain symmetry and a certain relationship, each section to the other. What Beethoven started to do was to tear asunder these relationships. And of course, from Beethoven, it was an easy step to a man like Liszt, whose entire impulse was to have no relationships existing, free fantasy form, a free surging of the creative impulse, without any boundaries and binds whatsoever. Is it very far to go from Liszt and his concept to Schoenberg and his concept of absolutely no key relationships that there is no one fundamental tonality, which sets the fulcrum around which all the other aspects of the key and the relationship of one tone to another exist. What Schoenberg did was to make every tone in the scale of equal weight, of equal importance, and equally to be respected. Now, I don't know if this is the point for me to go into any more technical description of what tonality and atonality are. Should I? Okay. When we talk of tonality, that means that there is a certain home key. If a piece is in F major, C major, D major, what have you, that means that the fundamental musical harmonic structure revolves around that tonality of F or C or G or whatever it is. There are harmonic structures that are built on that, but they all relate to F major. And as important as F major or C major or whatever the dominant key is, and you can see why it's called the dominant, because it is the fundamental basis around which everything revolves, almost of the same importance is the fifth above it. If you're talking in terms of a C major work, then G, the tone G, the dominant, is almost of equal weight. So that within the structure of a given tonality sequence, there is a dominant, a tonic, and these elements interrelate with one another in certain fundamental ways. In the Schoenberg attitude, there is no one key and no one tone within a 12-note chromatic scale which is any more important than any other. Each is of equal weight, each is of equal fundamental importance, and no longer does one describe a work as being in D major or C major or what have you. It is a composition, a work which is made up of individual tonalities, all of them of the same importance. Now, what some people rebel against in the Schoenberg structure is that a row of tones is arranged, and those tone rows must be repeated in the same order each time. Some people feel that this kind of structure runs counter to principles not only of physics but of physiology, that there has to be some sort of change, variation, so that if you get C, F, and B following together, that you sometimes can vary that to be C, A, E, rather than C, F, and B always coming in the same sequence. Now, Schoenberg had very good reasons for wanting a row to be constantly repeated in the same form. But since Schoenberg stated his principles of atonality, we have had the consequent development, which has happened throughout the period of history, an emendation and a change in the principles that have been enunciated by a fundamental innovator, so that there are composers who are atonal composers who approach their craft from the point of view, from the fundamental point of view of Schoenberg, that is, that there is no one principal fundamental key which dominates, that all the tones are of equal importance and of equal validity, but they break down the fabric of the tone row, so that the row is no longer repeated in the same unwavering and constantly undeviating structure, continuity, that Schoenberg enunciated. There are successful composers who still stay to the tried and true, absolutely prescribed Schoenberg method. There are unsuccessful composers who deal with that method. There are successful composers who deal with a variation, breaking down the continuity of line of the tone row. There are those who are successful in doing that and those who are unsuccessful in doing it. The whole question of how to innovate is one that has to happen naturally. If a composer sets as one of his guiding principles the fundamental idea that he is going to be an innovator, then I think he defeats himself almost before he starts. Because innovation has to happen spontaneously and naturally rather than being consciously determined and arrived at. Now, some of you may question what I've just said in relationship to a man like Schoenberg, because he very definitely sat down and devised a whole new compositional technique, figuring it out mathematically, physically, and for him, emotionally. The paradox is that Schoenberg, this great innovator, is one of the least performed composers of the 20th century, even now, 20-odd years after his death. True, he did not compose a great deal of music. He did not create in a variety of forms. There is a relative handful of works. There are some chamber pieces, some orchestral works, some songs, a couple of operas. In the main, Schoenberg is known more as a figure in history than as an active, alive composer. And by using the term alive, I mean in terms of the performance of his music. Schoenberg died in 1951. There are other Schoenberg disciples, the most famous of whom are Berg and Webern, whose music is much more in the active mainstream of performance than is the music of the fountainhead Schoenberg. Today we find composers grappling and struggling with problems that really are unique to our time. We find composers working in various electronic media. Now, electronic music is and has been with us for almost 30 years now. It's a direct outgrowth of experimentation that took place first during the Second World War, when tape recorders first came into use. The precursor of electronic music was something that was called in those days, 1947, 8, 9, 50, musique concrète. Obviously, it was French in its original derivation and impulse. And what musique concrète was, very simply, was a taping, using this new technology of tape recording, of natural sounds. Creators would go into the field and record sounds wherever they're to be found. Railroad trains jogging along on their tracks, household noises, the sounds of nature, birds twittering, what have you. They would have these sounds on their tape machines, and then they would metamorphose those sounds by the means that are available through the use of tape recordings. And we have some recent evidence on the political scene of what can be done with music that's recorded on tape, or sounds that are recorded on tape. The sounds can be slowed down. They can be speeded up. They can be transferred from one piece of tape to another. And this, in the very primitive stages, what was musique concrète was all about. Composers would take these tape-recorded sounds and metamorphose them. You would get the sound of a running brook, and it would be slowed down many, many times. This would take increasing re-recording techniques, of course, until the sound of that running brook resembled a rumble in a cave, perhaps, or some totally disparate sound from what the originally produced sound represented. Well, given that as a technique, it was not very long before composers discovered that using this method of sound, first of all, sound recording and then sound transposing, they could create all kinds of different images on tape, and I must underline on tape, because musique concrète existed only on tape, as a taped reproduction of sounds. It was not very long before composers began to do all kinds of things with these taped sounds, and then, and much more recently has this been the case, to combine those taped sounds with live sounds produced by live people, by instruments and by people playing those instruments. And I think the slow evolution of what we call electronic music today has come about in a very healthy way. First, there was experimentation with who knew what direction lay ahead. And then there became a closer intermingling of human involvement. And now we have some music, not much, but some music, which I think is going to be heard in the future. Music which combines the sounds produced by human beings playing instruments with sounds that are created through some other sound impulse. There's also computer music that's being created today. Music that is put on a computer punch card, or impulses that are put on a computer punch card, information fed into a computer, and the computer gives out sounds. The computer, of course, can produce sounds also. Now, where is all this leading to? I certainly don't have the answer to that question. I don't think anybody does. What it is leading to is the evolution that has been proven by history, that 0.5% of the given art of any period will last. We have a tendency to look back on the great golden period of the 19th century, that extraordinary period that produced Beethoven and Schubert and Mendelssohn and Schumann and Brahms and Tchaikovsky, and the list goes on and on and on. That is certainly a fact of life. That period did produce all those great creators. It also produced people like Kalkbrenner and Ries and 100 and 1,000 and 10,000 people whose output was meaningful in their own time and which is totally forgotten now. And we must never lose that perspective. Everything that is produced in any one period is pertinent to that period. We may find that we have our ears assaulted by material that is less desirable than other material that we hear, but it's all reflective of the currents and the impulses that feed our lives today. That doesn't mean that it's going to be meaningful to people a generation from now, but it is meaningful today, and we ought to keep our ears open for everything. At the same time, employing our own powers of discrimination to sort out for ourselves what is meaningful to us and what is garbage to us. The history of art is inundated by garbage, and the meaningful art is 0.5% over the period of history. So that while you may find that we are at a fallow period in productivity these days, that is not so, and it is certainly no different from what has ever prevailed in music particularly, and in the arts in general. I like question and answer confrontations, and I think I'm going to move, having said this much about what I feel is my reaction to the first question on your cards, I'm going to leave it at that and hope that I've piqued somebody's curiosity and perhaps anger, and we'll get to questions on that during the question and answer period. The next question on your card is, how is the format of concerts changing? As far as my vantage point allows me to see things, it's changing in a very fundamental way. Concerts mean, I think, one fairly fundamental thing to those of you who are seated here this morning, and they may mean quite something else to a whole other vast concert-going public. I remember a few years ago, my son, who is now 16, he was maybe 13 at the time, about 3 years ago, came to me and said, "Hey, Dad, there's a concert at Carnegie Hall I really would like very much to go to." And that was one of the most gratifying things that I heard at that point. All the work was apparently not in vain. I said, "Great, David, what is it? And I'll see if I can get tickets." He said, "Crawford, Seals, and Nash are coming to Carnegie Hall." Well, you see, it's all in the perspective. We think of concerts as occasions when either many individual instrumentalists come together to play the great standard and contemporary literature of so-called concert music, or a distinguished solo performer comes on the stage and enthralls us with the magnetism, the dynamism, and the superhuman virtuosity of which he or she is capable. And there are hundreds of thousands and millions of people to whom concerts mean something quite else. There is a whole series of in-concert television programs these days, on late at night to be sure, but they're of the Crosby, Stills and Nash and Allman Brothers and Moody Blues variety, and they are concerts. They are concerts because they do precisely what Horowitz or the Boston Symphony or the Chamber Society of Lincoln Center do. They come together and they make music, and the people who come as audience come to receive the spiritual message which is implicit in music. So the format of concerts is changing in many different ways, and that's just one way. The great vernacular musical organizations and individuals are giving concerts today, where a generation ago it would have been I'm overstating it. I was about to say it would have been inconceivable to think of the great popular vernacular artists of the day. Let's go back to Frank Sinatra at the Paramount Theater in the 40s. I think he would have been horrified if someone had described that performance as a concert. Sure, it was a performer up there performing, but it was a whole other bag. Today, the Allman Brothers give concerts, and the kids who go to the Allman Brothers go to the concert of the Allman Brothers. They go with the same feeling of participation and joy and overall musical receptivity that we bring to the concerts of the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. Now, to get to the kind of concert that we would think of as being a concert, there is a fundamental problem, and it relates to many issues in our society today, many of them social, a fundamental problem in the concert-giving apparatus. At one time, and it's not too many years ago, there was a certain advance and anticipatory kick to dressing up for a concert, to dressing up for a formal occasion where great music of the past and the present would be experienced. There are many people today who feel that that's an intrusion. Why should one put on the dog to go hear Beethoven or Mahler or Stockhausen? Why should that be a requirement of formal participation in a social event? So that the dress habits of the concert-going public today, as I needn't tell you, are wildly different from what one would have encountered in concert halls 5 years ago even. In Avery Fisher Hall this evening, you will find the widest variety of dress on the part of the audience. There are those people who will attend in fairly formal garb. There are those people who will be less formally attired. There are going to be lots of people, old and young, who will be there in jeans and open T-shirts. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think the fundamental aspect of sharing something together is to share it without being bound by superimposed customs, traditions, or what have you. They're also changing in their own format, in the giving of the concerts. Orchestras, soloists, smaller ensembles are finding that they too are bridling against the formality of the austere concert world. One of the most unexpected successes of last year's New York Philharmonic series was that series of rug concerts. Now, the rug concerts came about almost by accident. In their new trade agreement, the management promised the musicians of the orchestra that they would be able to depend on salary checks from the New York Philharmonic 52 weeks of the year. And the Philharmonic management, in its searching about for ways and means of keeping the orchestra employed, decided that they would attempt something like what Boulez had done in London at the Promenade concerts. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the whole concept of Promenade concerts in London. They're extraordinary events which take place during the summer months in antiquated Royal Albert Hall, an enormous barn of an auditorium which seats, probably 6,000 or so, but which is able to accommodate many more thousands standing. And the kind of program that's given at Royal Albert Hall is really incredible. It makes no concession to the time of year. We have had the habit in this country of thinking in terms of lighter concert fare during the summer months. Well, the promenades, despite their name, will have nothing of this. They give their audiences the most solid and the most substantial repertoire, much more so, as a matter of fact, than during the normal concert season, October to May. The promenade concerts go in for the most in Philharmonic Hall. And so they devised the idea of pulling out the entire auditorium floor seats and letting the audience either stand or sit down, recline, what have you, and enjoy great music, solid, substantial music from the traditional literature and from contemporary music. And I think the management went into this whole rug concept with literally its heart in its mouth. They had absolutely no idea what reception the rug concerts would have. Well, they were phenomenally successful. There was only 1 week of them, unfortunately, because there were other commitments. And there will be only, I guess, a week this year, in June again, probably. But the plans for future years are to expand the period of rug concerts and to bring about this great feeling of informality that has developed in the rug concert concept, to expand upon it and to make music a much less austere kind of social event. Music is created to be commonly, mutually enjoyed and experienced, and anything that, within reason, anything that can enhance that sort of participation is something that we all ought to back and put all our enthusiasm behind. The concert-going situation is, I think, a very important one. And there are those prophets of gloom who say that not too many years hence, the symphony orchestra will be a museum piece and concert-going will disappear. I certainly hope that they're dead wrong. And if one can look at what's going on in the Allman Brother Moody Blues kind of concert interaction and perhaps bring some of that same kind of delight to attending a performance of a Mahler symphony, then we really have made progress in this last third of the 20th century. Question number 3. How does contemporary opera differ from the past? Here I think we have to speak in terms of broad social conditions. When the great operatic literature was being created, and I think let's define historical periods when I say that. The first opera, as we know opera today, dates from the early years of the 17th century, 1607, Monteverdi's Orfeo, which does receive occasional performances these days, and there was a very successful revival of Orfeo at the Edinburgh Festival some years ago. And there are occasional performances by our performing groups in this country generally and in New York. But let's really define our terms. The viable operatic repertory represents the period roughly from 1750 until 1925. 1750, when there were operas just ahead of the great operas of Mozart. 1925, the period when Berg composed Wozzeck and Puccini was working on Turandot. There have been thousands of operas created since 1925. I don't think anybody in this room can point to one that's an active repertory item in an opera house anywhere in the world. Let's take a look at the world between 1750 and 1925. And we don't have to spend too much time on this. But the theater and the musical theater of that roughly 200-year period was one means of the upper class of society entertaining itself. Many operas were created for royal enjoyment, and the audience for opera enjoyment was pretty well restricted to a certain segment of society at large. There were composers all during those years who rebelled against this and who wanted their creations for the musical theater to be infused into the bloodstream of every man. And some of those attempts were successful, others were not successful. But by and large, the mechanics and the apparatus involved in the creation of an opera were available because they were made available by the landed and the wealthy. We come to 1974, and we're all familiar with the crises that our performing institutions are encountering, particularly those institutions that are concerned in the production of opera, and very specifically the Metropolitan Opera, whose financial woes we've all read about on the front page. The budget that the Metropolitan Opera operates under this year is something between $20 and $25 million, and that's a lot of $1 million. In order to make it a viable organization, that kind of money has to be constantly either available or at least possible to be counted on. And for that kind of money to be available in the society in which we live, all kinds of things are going to have to change. For one thing, there has to be a massive infusion of federal support. Now, that's a bugaboo to some people, and it's a horror to others. A horror from the standpoint of immediately anticipating that there would be government intervention and government, hate to use the word dictation, and yet I can't think of any other, government dictation of policy and of repertory. That's not an untenable position, and yet it's a position that has to be counterbalanced and counteracted. In many ways, the federal government of this country has been involved in the arts for many, many years. I'm sure many of you experienced and worked in the extraordinary artistic efforts that were undertaken during the 1930s under the WPA. It was a period of enormous flourish in the arts, in literature, in theater, in music. And there were WPA projects which made these things possible. There were WPA symphony orchestras all over the country. There were WPA theater groups which did extraordinary things in theater, all made possible by government funds. And in no way did those government funds carry a string. There was nobody in Washington dangling puppet strings and telling conductors of WPA symphony orchestras or directors of WPA theater projects what music or what plays to put on. There was nobody who was the artistic commissar during the 1930s. So that we have a history of federal support for the arts, enabling and allowing the arts to flourish as perhaps they had never before flourished in this country, and I'm almost tempted to say as they have never flourished since, and yet without the intrusion of government dictation as to how and why and what. Obviously, we have to be very vigilant, on guard, to see that the kind of horror that might be possible just does not come about. But we also must be vigilant, and we must bombard our congressmen, senators, representatives, impressing upon them the need, the absolute vital need for federal involvement in funding for the arts. Excuse me. Here in New York, we're much better off than many other states in the nation are. Our New York State Council for the Arts operates with a pretty healthy budget, much healthier than that of many neighboring states and most states in the Union. And there was recently announced a project by the New York State Council on the Arts of grants for individual composer creators. This is a new thing in the life of the New York State Council of the Arts. Heretofore, they've made grants to organizations or institutions. Recently, they announced some 96 grants to composers. Now, those grants are connected to a performing organization. The grants are actually given to an organization which then commissions a work from a composer. But the thing is very closely interrelated, and so that the funding does indeed come directly to the composer. This kind of thing is like firing buckshot. Out of 96 grants, there may be 96 works that will be totally useless. There may be 3 works that will have some merit and value. There may be 20 works that, as a result of this commissioning project, will enrich our lives and enrich the repertory. I don't think there's any other way to do it. I think the artist has to be regarded by us, and by us I mean really, literally by us, those of us who have any interest in the arts whatsoever. The artist has to be nurtured by us, and the artist has to be encouraged. There are many ways of doing it, and obviously the most direct and the most meaningful way to the individual artist is to enable him to go and do what it is that he wants to do without regard for wondering where next week's food allowance money is going to come from. And you would be amazed at how many artists, and I don't use the term artists lightly, how many of them really are overridden by that concern. The income that a composer derives in the first instance from publication, if that's forthcoming, and publication is becoming increasingly difficult. But let's say that there is a publisher who undertakes the publication of the music of a composer. The sum that's paid to the composer for publication rights is minuscule. How then does a composer earn money? Well, if he's lucky enough, he'll get performances. And if he's lucky enough to belong to one of the performing rights organizations, the performing rights organization will collect money from the source and then distribute it to the creator. There are some composers today whose income from performing rights societies is very great. There are some composers of concert music whose income merely from performance is in the $80,000 to $100,000 a year range. Of course, they are the great exceptions. In the main, our concert music creators are on the fringe of income. And any means and any methods by which that situation can be changed are means and methods that we all ought to put our shoulders to. Now, I've been up here about 50 minutes, and I think I've addressed myself to these 3 questions as I see them, and I welcome your questions, reactions, and challenges. Yes? Mm-hmm. Fine. It's a very good point that you raise. Let me go back to Mozart and Schubert, your examples. During the period that Mozart was creating his operas, Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così, and so forth, there were theaters not too far from where he was functioning that were waiting with bated breath to put on the Marriage of Figaro. Prague, when it put the Marriage of Figaro on, became the musical center of Central Europe at that point. And Mozart had a marvelous experience in Prague, and Prague commissioned a new opera from Mozart. Mozart's operas became the South Pacific of its time, or The King and I, or what have you, and houses throughout Europe were putting on performances of The Marriage of Figaro. Excuse me, New York is a winter festival, and I have one of those relics of it. Thanks, Vivian. One of the problems that a composer of opera faces today is, where is his opera going to be performed? Sure, there are opera workshops that dot this country, and there are a good number of professional opera companies that are scattered throughout Europe. Germany has, I don't know how many hundreds of professional opera houses. But the American opera composer, unless he wants to think of himself in terms of a college workshop creator, really has very little opportunity to see his opera produced. The last American opera that was done by the Metropolitan Opera was Marvin David Levy's Morning Becomes Electra. Good, bad, or indifferent, and I'm not arguing the merits or the demerits of Morning Becomes Electra. That was in the season 1966-67. It's a long time ago in terms of American operatic creation in our leading American opera house. Some years ago, before it moved to the State Theater in Lincoln Center, the New York City Opera used to put on whole seasons of American operas in the spring. They had a repertory of 6, 8, 10 American operas, which they would produce in repertory. They haven't been doing that at the State Theater since their move to the State Theater, for one very dominant and understandable but unfortunate reason: the financing involved. In order to function and to create some sort of viability for itself as an institution, the New York City Opera has cut back totally on its seasons of American opera, and indeed on its season of contemporary opera in general. Sure, the New York City Opera has done operas of Ginastera in the last few years. And there's a new Ginastera opera on which he's working right now, at this very moment, as a matter of fact, which will be done as part of the bicentennial celebrations by the New York City Opera. But the times now are different, and I'm afraid the underlying factor is the economic one. A composer who sees that, what's the point of writing an opera which is going to languish on the shelf of my library, when, with all the blood that I pour into it, I could use some of that same blood in the creation of a chamber music piece or in the creation of a commercial jingle for television, and I'll be able to eat and have some sort of way of keeping bone and limb together. That's a very important consideration for composers. And while the creative spark may be there, it's discouraged by the non-availability of performance. That's an important factor of life. And when I say that the federal government should be pressured into support, it's precisely for this, so that there will be no reason of discouragement on the part of a creator, that there will be roads opened up to him for the performance of his work. And while it may be totally useless, let the value judgments of time enter into it. It's certainly better to have a work that's valueless than not to have the work at all, because the work that's not composed may be of extraordinary and enormous import, but it never gets written. Very unfortunate. Yes. That's an interesting concept. Let me first attack your opening statement that the climate seems to be against federal support. I don't think that's so. I think the climate, rather, is changing and growing increasingly sensitive to the need for federal. Well, Yeah, that's true where scientific research is concerned and where medical research is concerned. Strangely enough, the current administration has been, well, I was about to say okay. It hasn't been okay where the arts are concerned, but it has not been resistant in the degree that it's been resistant to medical and science. The budget, and I wish I had the figures at my fingertips, the budget for federal support for the arts to the National Endowment for the Arts for fiscal year 1975 is about 10 times what it was a few years ago. And the allocation has been growing each year. Now, there is enormous resistance in Congress, of course. Some of the congressmen feel that this is a total encroachment of government, that government should not be involved in this at all and let the arts sink or swim under their own power. Some of the arguments raised against federal support by congressmen are, why should our tax dollars, or the tax dollars of our constituents, be allocated for an activity which, after all, is a great minority interest at best, that there is a substantially insignificant amount of people in terms of the total population for whom this activity is going to be meaningful in any way. But there are, fortunately, organizations, pressure groups, I've got to use that word, who have used the power of their pressure and their lobby to countervene this kind of negative reaction on the part of congressmen. One of the most effective organizations of this kind is the National Federation of Music Clubs, which has its national headquarters here in New York and has chapters all over the country. I don't know how many hundreds and maybe even thousands of chapters, local chapters there are of the Federation of Music Clubs. They number something in membership, people who pay dues to them, about 750,000. And they're active, vibrant, dynamic women, for the most part, who, when the chips are down and when legislation comes before the Congress, which is involved in the arts, exert the pressure of their power, and so far they've been very effective. So I think rather than the climate being negative where federal involvement is concerned, I think it's getting better all the time. Now, I'm sorry I forgot. Yes. Going back, right. That's an interesting concept in terms of this. A couple of months ago, I attended I can't call it a convention because that endows it with too much importance. Excuse me. Rather, it was a meeting of concerned individuals representing organizations, convened at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on Amsterdam at 113th, 114th Street, convened by the music director at the cathedral, a man named Alec Whiten, who's also a composer, whose prime reason for convening this group was to explore ways and means that the church, and I use the church generically, I mean houses of worship generally, ways and means that houses of worship which employ music so importantly in their overall operations, and not only music of the past, but contemporary music, how these houses of worship can better come into the mainstream of contemporary musical life. And one of the thoughts that was advanced by one of the people at the meeting was that there ought to be houses of worship that take composers in residence, who attach composers to their institutions, pay them whatever subsidy it is per year, don't tie them exclusively to them, but hopefully as a result of this subsidy over a year or two or three, the composer will create a work or works for use in the worship, but at the same time make it possible for that composer to know that X number of dollars is income that he can count on for that period, which will free him to do other things, to compose for the church, but also compose for the concert hall, or the opera house, or the television studio, whatever it may be. I think this is just one way of private support for our creators, but I think it's a way that offers some possible fruitful territory to be looked at. And I don't think it's demeaning. I think there might be a feeling on the part of some of you that this might demean the composer. Not at all. There's nothing unsavory or unclean about a person, whoever he may be, being able to earn income from the fruit of whatever it is that he produces. I don't want to reduce it to a level of sheer commerce, but the creators of our time have a property just as any manufacturer has a property. And the creators of our time ought to be able to count on income being produced from the fruits of their productivity, just as a manufacturer does. Yes?
Mr. Bookspan, I'm one individual who believes that the government must have some control in some aspects. And the one aspect that bothers me most is the volume of which music is being played. I was rather adventuresome this past summer. I went to a concert which I questioned in my mind whether I would like the music. But anyway, I thought I must expose myself. So I went, and the music was so loud it was painful. I asked the individual who was walking up and down, showing the ushers, in other words, I said, are you aware that this music is quite loud and it's very painful? And she pulls out something from her ear and says, you must bring some wax with you. And as I sat there listening further, I thought to myself, it's unbelievable that the ushers are given wax and we're not. I went outside and I asked to speak with the head usher. I spoke with him and he says, oh, I want you to go to the hallway. He pulls out wax from his ears. I said, may I please speak with the stage director? I spoke with the stage director. They took me in the back, spoke with the manager and some other people. They all insisted that this group that was there were two groups, had been told in the afternoon that the music was loud, but that the artist said that this was part of their creative music and that it must be this volume. And I spoke with the artist, which it was impossible, and he was anxious to get back on stage, so I just left it alone. And as I looked at my program, I saw National Council for Arts, and I thought to myself, this is unbelievable that in the 20th century, our tax money is being put into areas that we're generating a generation of deaf citizens. Really.
Yeah.
I went home, I wrote 20 letters at least. I have yet to even hear from anyone that they received my letter.
They can't hear.
And I mean, I also state further that this music, what they were singing, was some language that came from Mars or Venus or something. It wasn't a language. I asked what language this was, and then they gave out papers and said that there wasn't this. The violins were electronic, hooked up to electronics.
Mm-hmm.
The side of Philharmonic Hall was one great big column of sound equipment on top of the other. And everybody was enjoying themselves. I was the only one who was there.
Well, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. All of us do, obviously. The question of the volume of music at which rock is played, and I presume this was, if not a rock concert, a quasi-rock activity.
Exactly rock.
Yeah.
It was symphonic, and there was bands
Mm-hmm.
and things like this. And they had, I think it was called New Symphony. I mean, I have my program at home.
Mm-hmm.
I could, relate further.
Yeah.
But they didn't consider themselves rock.
I think, as most things in this world are, this is a temporary aberration. For whatever reason, the use of the latest technology, sometimes in the early stages, runs away with itself. And I think the practitioners of amplified sound have allowed themselves to be overtaken by the craft that's available, by twiddling knobs and all. I seem to think that there's a waning of the decibel level at concerts, and I think there's some sensitivity and receptivity to the thought that it doesn't have to be painful in order to be audible. To get back to my own kids for a minute, I find that in their listening too, where a couple of years ago they would blast it as loud as possible. They're doing less blasting now and more listening, because when it blasts, you're not really hearing the sound, you get some kind of visceral impression. And when you're all, 5,000 together jiving on this conglomerate sound, there's a physiological reaction which is quite apart from what it is that the music is telling you. So I think there's a slackening of the assault on the ears from the point of view of sound. There are composers who feel that they really have to overwhelm you and make it physically painful before their message comes across. A perfect example, Cause Célèbre, a couple of summers ago at Tanglewood, the new concerto for amplified violin and orchestra by Charles Warrenen was played. Warrenen insisted that he should be at the controls, and the performance was a shambles, mostly because the decibel level at which he insisted that amplified violin should be heard was unbearable. It was performed, and I missed the Carnegie Hall performance earlier this season, concert of the Buffalo Philharmonic. I wish I had been there only to see if Warrenen had learned that he didn't have to bombard the audience with the sheer pain of the loudness of the violin in order to have them respond. Because I think the work intrinsically is a work of value, but it was absolutely unable, it was intolerable in the music shed at Tanglewood because of the loudness of the sound. Yes. In Carnegie Hall. Good. Yes. Yeah. The work I thought was more than passing interest, and yeah. Yes.
Do you think that the possibilities are exhausted for a modern composer to say something meaningful, new, and original using the older form?
Certainly not. There are composers functioning today who have as great respect for tonality and communication and melodic voluptuousness as the great melodists of the 19th century, as the great formalists of a century before that. And that is certainly a mine still to be explored and will continue to be.
Without having critics say, oh, well, that's just Wagner hashed over or Beethoven hashed over.
Now you're getting me into a whole other area. Critics. I will limit my remarks very briefly. My colleagues are a mixed bag, a motley collection of individuals. By and large, the critics in the daily press function under such enormous handicaps and under such great pressures that the daily press, as far as I'm concerned, is almost to be ignored. There are critics functioning on, some of them on weekly magazines, some of them on monthly magazines, who are much more dependable as insightful human beings. But the daily grind of having to turn out a review is of such enormity that at best they are doing as good a job as they possibly can, and at worst they just turn out something just for the sake of being able to fill space. I regret having to say this, but I've said it. Incidentally, before, when I was talking about tonality and atonality, I think I reversed the designation of key when I said that a work in C, F, or G, that key, that note, is the dominant. I meant that's the tonic, and the fifth above is the dominant.
Is it possible, this is a two-part question, is it possible for a composer to use tonality, atonality, and serial music all in one piece and turn out something good?
Well, to mix them all together, I don't think has really been done. There are composers who use a very free kind of atonality, which is nevertheless key-centered, but not firmly in the traditional manner. But to mix tonality, atonality, and electronics all together, I think would be almost incompatible as far as different elements.
Not electronics, I meant serial music.
Serial music? anything is possible, obviously. It's what comes out in the final mix. It seems to me offhand that the elements in that kind of work would fight one another. And you would jump around from one thing to another. If you're key-centered at one moment, and then suddenly in a row, and then into atonality, and back to normal harmonic structure, it seems to me that would be disruptive, maybe even irritating. You had your hand.
Yes, you explained so well what Schoenberg's contribution was to music. Could you tell us what Stravinsky's contribution?
Yes, well, I'm glad you mentioned Stravinsky, because in my estimation, Stravinsky is the giant of the 20th century. The force and the power, who was able to, by the strength of his own dynamic creativity, serve as a summing up of what had come before, and yet breathe into music a vibrant life, an exploration of, again, harmonic structure, because there is much in the harmonic underpinning of Stravinsky's music that is new and innovative. Rhythmic, of course, from The Rite of Spring on. No work created since The Rite of Spring has not come under its influence in one way or another. That's 60 years ago now. So that what I'm saying is that everything since 1913, in one way or another, reflects the impact of The Rite of Spring. Toward the end of his life, of course, Stravinsky went off into other paths, and through the intervention of Robert Kraft, was able to come to grips with the Schoenberg ideal, which had been anathema to him until that point. Stravinsky and Schoenberg were totally opposite polarities in the 20th century, until the 1950s, when Stravinsky examined some of the precepts of Schoenberg and saw that there were points of view in the Schoenberg ideal that were not incompatible with Stravinsky's thinking. And in the 1950s and 60s, Stravinsky created some pretty important atonal music. The interesting thing is that, as is the case with so much of Schoenberg, the atonal creativity of Stravinsky is outside the repertory. It rarely is performed, and there are some very important works. For my mind, one of the most important of them, a very brief piece called Requiem Canticles, written in about 1965 or so, lasts maybe 8 minutes, but intellectually extraordinary and emotionally very, very directly communicative. A work that I would commend to you if you're not familiar with it. And just as a one-sentence answer to your question, what is my view of Stravinsky? The giant of the 20th century.
Oh, no, I didn't ask you that. I know that.
Okay.
In view of the success of the Promenade concerts and the Rug concerts, why are there prophets of doom, as you said, to the effect that the large symphony orchestra is on its way out?
I think this relates back to part of my answer to the question that this lady raised, economics. The sheer burden, that's the word, the burden of maintaining a symphony orchestra is becoming increasingly unmanageable. The musicians of the orchestra certainly are entitled to a living wage. When they engage in contractual squabbles with their management, they are fighting for the respect of the community. They are expert practitioners of their craft and entitled to a decent income as a result of being the expert practitioners of their craft that they are. On the other hand, management finds itself increasingly backed against a wall of demand upon demand upon demand, which translates in only one way, in dollars and cents, and becomes $1 million more and $1 million more and here and there. And it's a problem that I think can be solved. I don't think it can be solved, but can be ameliorated only by what I said before, federal involvement. Now, there's another reason for prophesying that the symphony orchestra will be an extinct dinosaur in a few years, and that also relates to something that I'd said before. Composers today find, as difficult as it is for an opera composer to find performances at the Metropolitan Opera, it's increasingly difficult for a composer for orchestra to get his works performed by our great symphony orchestras. And what is the logical consequence of that? The creators will move away from writing music for orchestra and into writing music for other combinations, for chamber combinations and for solo instrumentalists. And if the repertory for orchestra is not continually infused with new works, then the symphony orchestra as an institution is going to be nothing more than a museum. And the infusion of new works is vital to the continuing well-being of the orchestra. So that the whole thing is really interrelated. We as audience have to hear everything. Doesn't mean that we have to like everything. And it certainly doesn't mean that everything we hear is going to be heard next year or 10 years from now. But we have to go to everything and hear it and listen to it with ears that are our own ears, so that we accept what we want to accept and reject what we want to reject. But by getting music performed and by getting it into a viable life situation, that's the way to ensure that the symphony orchestra will be with us in the year 2001 and 2073, Woody Allen's year, or 2173.
Well, I think one way of ensuring that the morning lectures go on is to have a person like Martin Bookspan.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.